My name is Maggie Doyle. I'm 62. A retired teacher from Portland. And if you'd told me 2 years ago that my own daughter-in-law would drag me out of my son's wedding by my hair, I'd have laughed in your face. But that night, under the glow of champagne lights, something in me broke and something else woke up. They thought I'd stay quiet, that I'd swallow humiliation the way older women are supposed to. But silence has a way of turning into fuel when the truth's been stolen from you. So let me ask you, what would you do if the people you loved most built their happiness on your ruin? I'm going to tell you what I did. And I promise, by the time you hear it all, you'll understand why peace can sometimes sound a lot like revenge. When I first saw the picture, I thought it was someone else. A woman with gray hair, her head bent back, her face twisted in shock, lying on a marble floor under the golden lights of a wedding ballroom. But it was me. My hands were up, my hair tangled in the grip of another woman's fist, my son frozen behind her. The caption said simply, "Portland's wedding of the year takes a dark turn." Within hours, that photo was everywhere. Hashtags were already spreading. Justice for Maggie. Bridezilla. Number family gone wrong. I sat in my small kitchen, the morning light barely touching the counter, and stared at the phone until it went dark. I didn't cry. I just felt something heavy settle inside me. The kind of weight that doesn't move even when you breathe. You spend 66 years thinking you've seen enough of life to not be surprised anymore. Then you wake up to find millions of strangers watching you fall. It's strange how quiet a house can feel when the whole world is making noise about you. The clock above the stove ticked like it was mocking me. The coffee pot still half full from yesterday. I thought about turning on the TV but didn't. They were probably talking about it there too. The picture had been on the local news site already. The comments piling up like debris after a storm. Some people said I must have done something awful to deserve it. Others called me a saint. Nobody really knew anything. I picked up the phone again. Ryan's face stared back at me from my screen. My son. My only child. I hadn't spoken to him since the wedding. I couldn't bring myself to. The image of him standing there, his face pale while his wife dragged me by the hair, replayed over and over. Every time I blinked, I saw it again. The night before the wedding, I had ironed my best blue dress. The one Daniel always said, made my eyes look calm. Daniel's been gone 3 years now. Heart failure. Quick and quiet like everything he did. He used to joke that I worried too much about appearances. I could almost hear him that morning. His voice in my head. "You're going to be fine. Maggie. It's Ryan's big day. Just smile and don't overthink it." I remember holding that thought, like a prayer, as I packed the small box with a gift for them. A framed photo of Daniel and Ryan fishing at Crater Lake. Taken when Ryan was 9. I had written a card inside that said, "For your new beginning. Remember where you came from." Simple words. Maybe too simple. I taped the box shut and placed it in the passenger seat like it was something fragile. The drive from my house in southeast Portland to the venue in Lake Oswego took 40 minutes. The sky was pale gray, the kind that could turn to rain without warning. I hummed softly to fill the silence. When I arrived, the parking lot was already overflowing with rented cars and a catering truck unloading champagne crates. The venue looked like a dream. All white roses and string lights. Elegant and expensive. Exactly Emily's taste. Emily Carter Hayes, my new daughter-in-law, had been very clear in her wedding emails. "Please keep things simple. Maggie. We're trying for a modern aesthetic," which I'd taken as her polite way of saying, "Don't wear anything that'll ruin the pictures." I'd chosen my dress carefully. Classic but understated. A soft navy with a silver brooch that used to be my mother's. Inside, the music played softly. Violins warming up. Everything smelled of peonies and money. I found my seat at the far end of the reception area, near the service door. It didn't bother me at first. I told myself there were more important things than seating charts. But still, I noticed. My name written small, almost like an afterthought. Ryan came by before the ceremony started, looking handsome and nervous in his suit. He kissed my cheek and said, "Thanks for coming, Mom." I smiled and said, "Of course. Where else would I be?" He hesitated, then added, "Just, let's make today peaceful." Okay. I wanted to ask peaceful for who, but I didn't. I just squeezed his hand and said, "Always." When Emily walked down the aisle, all eyes were on her. She looked flawless, every strand of her blonde hair pinned in place, her smile wide for the cameras. She didn't glance at me once. That was fine. I told myself. She was nervous. Brides are nervous. But a small voice inside whispered, "No. Maggie." She meant it that way. I watched the ceremony, the vows, the applause. When they were announced, husband and wife, I clapped along with everyone else, proud and aching at the same time. It's a strange thing, watching your son promise forever to someone who barely tolerates you. After the ceremony, people began to mingle. Waiters floated by with trays of champagne and tiny hors d'oeuvres I couldn't pronounce. I spotted Emily, laughing with her friends near the floral arch. Photographers circling like bees. For a moment, I thought about leaving quietly. I could say I was tired. Drive home. Pretend the day had been lovely. But I wanted to hand her the gift. Just to show goodwill. To show I still believed we could be a family. So I made my way through the crowd, clutching the box. When I reached her, she turned mid-laugh, surprised to see me. "Oh, Maggie," she said, her smile brittle. "What are you doing here?" I blinked. "It's your wedding." "Emily, I came to give you this." She hesitated, her friends watching, their smiles polite and sharp. She nodded toward a nearby table. "Sure. You can leave it there." I tried to hand her the champagne flute I'd just picked up from a waiter. Maybe to toast, to break the ice. She looked away. And then it happened. That one stupid second. Someone brushed past me. My elbow shifted, and the champagne spilled. A thin golden splash across her white silk bodice. The sound around us stopped. Her face went white, then red. "You ruined my dress," she shouted. I started to apologize. But before I could say a word, she grabbed a handful of my hair. The world blurred. I stumbled, hearing gasps, flashes popping. Ryan shouted something I couldn't make out. Then the cold of the marble floor met my palms. Her fingers were still tangled in my hair when the first camera clicked. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the music stopping and someone yelling to call security. Now, days later, that same picture is everywhere. I keep wondering if anyone in those millions of views noticed the look on my face before I fell. Not anger. Not fear. Just disbelief that the people I loved most had watched it happen. And I wonder if somewhere out there, Emily's looking at that photo too, realizing what she did. But maybe not. Maybe she still thinks she won. Outside, the rain started tapping against the window. Portland rain. Soft, steady, relentless. I closed my eyes and whispered to no one. Maybe this is how it starts. Not the end. Just the storm before something clean. The morning after the wedding, the world still felt damp from the storm. I sat on the porch, wrapped in Daniel's old cardigan, listening to the drip of rain from the eaves. Everything smelled like wet cedar and shame. The newspaper on the table was folded open to a small photo. The one everyone had seen by now. They'd chosen the worst angle. Of course. Me, on the floor. Emily, towering over me. The article called it a misunderstanding between relatives. I let out a quiet laugh that didn't sound like me. It's funny how fast people form opinions when they don't know a thing about you. Neighbors who never waved before now slowed down their cars when passing my house. Some looked sympathetic, others just curious. By noon, I'd turned my phone face down to stop the buzzing. The internet had already decided who I was. When the doorbell rang, I thought it would be Heather, maybe checking on me. But it was Ryan. He looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was gone, his collar wrinkled. He stood in the rain, hands in his pockets, and said, "Can we talk?" "Mom." I stepped aside, letting him in. He didn't sit, just paced near the counter. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Emily didn't mean for things to get that far," he said finally. "She's been getting death threats online. It's bad. Mom, really bad." I looked at him, waiting for the part where he asked if I was okay. It didn't come. I poured coffee into 2 mugs and set one in front of him. I said, "Ryan." She dragged me by the hair, in front of everyone. "Do you understand that?" He rubbed his face and muttered, "It just got out of hand." That sentence, "It just got out of hand," was one I'd heard before. Daniel used to say it about work arguments, not assaults. I felt something tighten in my chest. I said quietly, "Your father would have walked out of that room before letting anyone touch me." Ryan looked up, startled. He started to speak, then stopped again. I could see his shame fighting with his loyalty. He said, "I just need you to let things calm down. If you could make a statement or something, say it was a misunderstanding, maybe it would die down. The company's worried it could affect my position." I stared at him, at my own son, asking me to lie to protect a woman who humiliated me. I almost said yes, just to make it easier for him. But then something inside me refused. I said, "Ryan, I raised you to tell the truth, not to clean up someone else's mess." He looked at me like I had slapped him. Then he whispered, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I said, "No. I think you both did that already." He left without finishing his coffee. The door clicked shut so gently it was worse than a slam. After he left, I walked through the house, touching things without really seeing them. The framed photo of his graduation, the fishing rod Daniel used, the couch where I used to read to Ryan as a boy. Everything felt like it belonged to someone else now. By afternoon, Heather came by, holding a grocery bag. She didn't ask if she could come in, just started putting food in my fridge. She said, "You need to eat something. You look like hell." I told her I wasn't hungry, but she ignored me. Then she said, "The photos everywhere. Maggie, you should see what people are saying." I said I didn't want to. She hesitated, then added, "There's one interview where Emily said you've been difficult, that you've never accepted her." My stomach turned. Difficult. That word has followed women my age our whole lives. Too honest. Too stubborn. Too emotional. Difficult. Heather leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. "You gonna let her run that story?" she asked. I looked at her, unsure. She said, "You've been quiet your whole life, Maggie. Maybe it's time to make some noise." I smiled faintly. "I've never been good at noise," I said. She laughed, not unkindly. "Well, lucky for you. The internet is." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes. The marble floor, the camera flash, Ryan's face frozen. I thought about calling him, but I knew he wouldn't answer. He was probably sitting beside Emily, telling her it would blow over. I wondered if he noticed how she talked to him now, giving orders, not suggestions. The next morning, I decided to drive to their apartment in downtown Portland. I needed to look my son in the eye, to understand how we had become strangers. When I got there, Emily opened the door. She looked flawless, even at 9 a.m. A silk robe tied neatly. Makeup perfect. Maggie, she said flatly. What are you doing here? I said. I came to see Ryan. He's at work, she replied. Then leaned against the doorframe. You probably shouldn't be here. Not after what happened. Her calmness was worse than her anger. I said. I wanted to apologize for the accident. She smiled tightly. Accident. You humiliated me. Maggie, do you even realize how that looked? The most important day of my life, and you made it about yourself. I took a breath. Choosing my words carefully. I didn't mean to. Emily, I was just trying to toast to your marriage. She stepped closer. Her perfume sharp. She said quietly. You're just the mother-in-law. Not family. Try to remember that next time. The words stung more than I expected. I opened my mouth to reply. But she was already closing the door. The click echoed down the hallway. I walked back to my car. My hands shaking. On the passenger seat sat the photo of Daniel and Ryan I had meant to give her. I picked it up, looked at their smiling faces, and whispered. Maybe it's better she never got it. At a red light on the drive home, I saw a headline flash on a screen outside a cafe, Bride attacks mother-in-law during Portland wedding. Underneath, the photo again. The one that had already carved its way into my life. I thought about what Heather said. About making noise. But what kind of noise does a woman like me make? The kind that no one hears until it's too late. When I pulled into my driveway, rain had started again. Portland rain always knows when to find you. I sat in the car, listening to the soft tapping on the windshield, trying to calm the storm in my chest. I thought of Daniel, of his steady hands and quiet laugh. He used to say, some people mistake silence for weakness. Let them. It makes the surprise sweeter when you finally speak. I don't know why that memory came then, but it stayed with me. Maybe it was his way of reminding me that stories like mine don't end in silence. Not this time. By the time the next weekend came, the sky had gone from silver to a heavy Portland gray. The kind that pressed down on you like a wet blanket. I thought staying busy would help. So I scrubbed the kitchen floor and folded laundry that didn't need folding. The silence in the house had changed. It wasn't peace anymore. It was waiting. Heather dropped by again. As she often did since the wedding. She stood at the counter, watching me polish the same cup 3 times. She said, "You're wasting your energy on the wrong kind of cleaning." I asked what she meant. She pointed to the phone on the table. People are still posting that photo. Maggie. It's everywhere. The video too. She paused. Someone's already claiming you're pressing charges. Are you? I shook my head. I hadn't decided. Part of me wanted to disappear until the noise died down. Another part, the part that still heard Daniel's voice in my head, whispered that staying quiet never fixed anything. Heather sighed and said, "You can't keep letting other people tell your story." I told her I wasn't ready. And she said softly, "Then get ready soon. Because the story's running without you." That night I dreamed I was back at the wedding. The sound of the violin cut short. The sting of fingers in my hair. But in the dream, it wasn't Emily pulling me. It was Ryan. I woke up, gasping. My heart pounding like I'd been running. When I looked at the clock, it was 3 a.m. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I decided to drive to the grocery store. Just to be around people who didn't know me. But of course, they did. At the checkout, the cashier looked at me, her eyes widening with recognition. "Aren't you the lady from that wedding video?" she asked. My stomach twisted. But I managed a polite smile. "I guess I am," I said. She leaned in. "That was crazy." "You okay?" I nodded, wanting to disappear through the linoleum floor. Back home. I turned on the TV for the first time since that day. A local news segment was running a discussion about online humiliation. There it was again. My photo. side by side with Emily's smiling face. The reporter said, "Sources close to the bride claim the incident was exaggerated and that the mother-in-law has a history of conflict." History of conflict. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I'd spent decades trying to be the kind of woman who didn't make waves. I was the volunteer at the library, the one who baked pies for church fundraisers, the neighbor who fed stray cats, and now I was a headline. A caricature of bitterness. The phone rang. Sharp and shrill. I almost didn't answer. But the name flashing on the screen made me pause. It was Nancy Lee. An old friend from when I worked at the elementary school. She'd gone into law later in life. And we hadn't spoken in years. Her voice was brisk and warm at the same time. "Maggie. I saw the news. I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" I said I was fine. Though we both knew that wasn't true. She said, "Listen. I don't want to pry. But if you need legal advice, call me. I mean it. There's something about this that doesn't smell right." After we hung up, I made tea and stood by the window. The rain had stopped, but puddles glistened across the street like little mirrors. I thought about Emily's face. How calm she'd looked when she told me I wasn't family. It wasn't said in anger. It was said like a fact. Later that day, Ryan called. His voice sounded careful, like someone walking on ice. "Mom," he said, "I think you should stay off social media for a while. Emily's trying to handle things, but people keep making it worse." I said, "Ryan, people didn't make it worse. She did." He sighed. "It was an accident. Can't you just let it go?" I wanted to ask how many times women like me have been told to let it go. How many bruises, insults, betrayals have been brushed aside under that same sentence. But I didn't. I just said, "I'll think about it," and hung up before he could say more. The afternoon drifted by in slow motion. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the sound of my own heartbeat too loud in my ears. When evening came, Heather sent me a message. "Maggie, you should see this." I opened the link. And there it was again. A new video angle. This time clearer. You could see Emily's hand in my hair. My body stumbling backward. The look on Ryan's face as he froze. I sat there watching it over and over until my tea went cold. There was no way to mistake what had happened. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was violence. Plain and simple. Heather texted again. "The video's blowing up. Some blogger wrote that you should sue." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the small box I'd meant to give them that day. The one with Daniel and Ryan's photo. The ribbon was still tied around it. I untied it slowly, looked at the picture, and whispered, "What would you do?" Daniel. In my head, I could almost hear him. He'd always been the calm one, the problem solver. But he wasn't here. And the silence that followed was mine to live with. I set the photo on the mantel and sat down. Around 9. There was a knock at the door. My heart jumped. For a second, I thought it might be Ryan again. Maybe finally understanding. But when I opened the door, 2 uniformed security officers from the wedding venue stood there. One held a clipboard. "Ms. Hayes," he asked. "We were asked to deliver a letter from the couple." I took the envelope, my hands trembling. After they left, I tore it open. It was short. A formal notice stating that I was no longer welcome at their home or future family events until further notice. It was written in Emily's neat, looping handwriting, signed by Ryan underneath. My throat closed up. I sat at the table, staring at the letter until the words blurred. The ache wasn't even anger anymore. It was grief. Deep and old. Like losing Daniel all over again. I didn't know how long I sat there before I picked up the phone and called Nancy back. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Nancy, do you still handle civil cases?" She hesitated, then said, I can. What happened? I looked at the letter. Then, at the dark window, where my reflection stared back. Something shifted inside me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was resolve. I said, I think someone needs to tell my side of the story. Nancy's voice softened. Then let's start there. After the call ended, I turned off every light except the lamp by Daniel's photo. The house was quiet again. But this time the silence didn't scare me. It felt steady. Like the pause before something true. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning. Before the sun had pushed through the clouds. The house was still wrapped in that gray light Portland wears like a habit. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The letter from Ryan and Emily still lying where I'd left it. The paper had curled slightly overnight, as if even it was tired of existing. I stared at it for a long time before picking up the phone. Nancy answered right away. Her voice steady. Practical. She said she could meet that afternoon at her office downtown. Bring the letter, she told me. And anything else that might be connected. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, trying to decide if this was really what I wanted to do. By noon, the drizzle had started again. I put on my black raincoat, the same one I'd had for years, and drove into the city. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a tired rhythm, keeping time with my thoughts. I'd been in downtown Portland 1,000 times before, but it looked different that day. Sharper. Like the city was watching me back. Nancy's office was in an old brick building near the river. The kind that smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. She met me in the lobby. Her hair pulled back tight. Her glasses perched halfway down her nose. She gave me a quick hug before leading me upstairs. Her office was small but warm, full of plants and law books. She gestured for me to sit and said, "Let's start with what you brought." I handed her the letter. She read it twice, lips pressed together, then set it down and said quietly, "That's not just cruel. It's calculated." I wasn't sure what to say. So I said, "I don't want to make things worse." Nancy looked at me for a long moment. "Maggie," she said, "you didn't make any of this. They did. All you're doing now is refusing to clean up after them. We went through everything." I told her about the wedding, the photo, the video, the conversations after revantation. I told her about Ryan asking me to call it a misunderstanding, about Emily's words at the door. Nancy took notes, occasionally asking for details. When I finished, she leaned back, tapping her pen against the notebook. "Here's the thing," she said. "You were assaulted in public. That's not something that goes away because someone's embarrassed. You could file a civil claim for emotional distress, even press charges if you wanted. But more than that, you need to protect yourself from the slander. They're shaping a narrative that paints you as unstable. If that sticks, it could affect your reputation. Even your finances." "My finances." I laughed softly. "There's not much left to affect." She smiled faintly. "That's not the point. It's about truth." She handed me a form. "This is just information gathering," she said. "No commitments yet." I stared at the paper. The legal jargon like another language. She must have noticed my hesitation because she said gently, "Maggie, this isn't revenge. It's correction. You deserve to live without this hanging over you." I signed the paper before I could talk myself out of it. When I left her office, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. I walked along the riverfront for a while, watching the water move slow and brown under the bridges. I remembered walking there with Daniel once, years ago, when Ryan was still a teenager. We talked about how fast the river looked from the bridge and how it only seemed calm from far away. That's how life felt now, still on the surface, but moving fast underneath. By the time I got home, the rain had stopped, and the sky had opened just enough to let in a strip of light. I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something close to steady. Then the phone buzzed. A message from Heather. "Have you seen this?" I clicked the link. It was a video clip from a gossip segment on a local talk show. Emily and Ryan, sitting together on a beige couch, being interviewed. Emily's makeup was perfect, her voice soft and trembling as she said, "It's been a really painful time for us. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just wish people would stop attacking me online." The host nodded sympathetically. "And your mother-in-law?" Emily looked down, then said, "I think she's struggling. It's hard when someone can't let go of control." Ryan sat beside her, silent, nodding slightly, like a man who'd been told what agreement looked like. I watched until the clip ended, my stomach turning. I didn't recognize my son in that video. The boy who used to call me when his car broke down, who once drove 2 hours just to fix my porch light, was gone. In his place was someone else's husband. Someone else's story. Heather called right after. "Maggie, you need to do something," she said. "They're using the press to make you the villain." I said quietly, "I know." She paused. "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked out the window at the street, the wet asphalt glinting under the streetlights. Then I said, "I think it's time they learn who they're dealing with." That night, I couldn't sleep again. But it wasn't fear this time. It was planning. I went through my old photo albums, pulled out pictures from the wedding, the rehearsal dinner, even old texts from Emily that showed her tone hadn't always been sweet. I made notes of names, dates, details. At some point around midnight, I opened my laptop and searched Emily's name. There she was on social media, posting smiling photos again. She'd turned off the comments, but people had started tagging me anyway. Half of them were sympathetic, the other half were cruel. Then something caught my eye. A comment under one of the photos from a woman named Kelsey Adams. She wrote, "Interesting to see him smiling again after everything." I frowned. I clicked her profile, but it was private. Still, the curiosity stuck. I copied her name into a note on my phone. The next day, I told Nancy about it over the phone. She said she'd look into it. But her voice carried that tone lawyers get when they already know there's more under the surface. I could tell she was piecing something together. By the afternoon, she called back. "Maggie," she said, "I found something. Emily's husband, your son, is listed as a co-owner on a business that was dissolved last year. The co-owner's name, Kelsey Adams." I felt my knees weaken, so I sat down. Nancy kept talking, explaining that the business had been flagged for unpaid taxes, but I barely heard her. My son, my Ryan, had been involved with another woman, maybe even before the wedding. After we hung up, I just sat there, staring at the wall. Everything started to click into place. Emily's hostility, her insecurity, her obsession with appearances. She must have found out. The humiliation at the wedding suddenly looked different. Maybe that night hadn't been about me at all. Maybe I was just collateral damage in her war with him. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. I stood up, walked to the mirror above the fireplace, and looked at myself. The woman staring back wasn't weak or broken. She was tired, yes, but something sharper was showing through now. If Emily wanted to play games with perception, she was about to find out what truth looked like in daylight. The rain began again outside. Soft at first, then harder, rattling the windows. I didn't move. I just watched it fall, steady and relentless, like something cleansing everything in its way. By Monday the rain felt purposeful, like it had chosen my roof as a drum. I made oatmeal I did not want and watched it cool beside the phone. The screen lit every few minutes with names I did not recognize. Messages stacked like leaves after wind. Some kind. Some ugly? Most certain. I kept turning the phone over, as if the glass could learn to behave. Heather called first. Her voice carried the clipped tone she used when she was trying not to swear. I just got a letter from a PR agency, she said. Fancy letterhead. Lots of words that mean, take the photos down, or we will bury you. She blew out a breath. I shot the wedding as a guest. I own the pictures. But they are banking on me being scared. Do what feels right. I said, I do not want you dragged into this more than you already are. Too late, she said. We are all in it. Then softer. If I pull them, they win the story. Are you okay with me holding the line? I looked at the gray light through the window. The same gray that had followed me since the reception. Tell the truth, I said. However you need to. She thanked me and hung up. 2 minutes later, she texted me a photo of the letter. The sharp language, underlined in red. The word defamation appeared 3 times. As if saying it loudly could make it true. I put on shoes and walked the neighborhood loop I had walked with Daniel 100 times. The trees along the sidewalk were dripping, and the air smelled like cedar and coffee grounds. Near the corner, 2 women I recognized from the market fell quiet as I passed. One of them gave me a small nod that was almost a bow. The other looked away. I kept walking. Familiar houses. Familiar porches. The life that had fit me so well until it did not. Back home. The mail was a swollen stack inside the box. On top was a thick envelope from an office in Lake Oswego. Inside, a bill for cleaning a couture wedding gown and a note that said I had caused distress to the bride and the brand. I let out a small sound that might have been a laugh. I placed the bill next to the letter, banning me from family events, and felt a strange calm settle. The kind that makes your hands steady rather than shake. The phone rang again. Ryan. His voice had that careful slope again. The one that kept sliding away from the point. Mom, he said. Emily is meeting with a crisis consultant this afternoon. They think if you could make a brief statement, it would take the temperature down. Something gracious about accidents and how weddings are emotional. He cleared his throat. It would help me too. Work is asking questions. I stared at the bills on the table. At my name, misspelled on the envelope like an eraser had run across it. Ryan. I said. I am not going to lie to help a story that is already lying. He let out a breath that sounded like defeat and impatience braided together. You do not have to lie. Just be generous. People will move on if you give them a way to. I pictured the marble floor. The bright flowers. Her fingers in my hair. Generous. I said. Is a word that belongs to the person who did not hurt anyone. He went quiet. I heard traffic through his car window. A horn. The hiss of tires on wet pavement. There is something else. I said, before I could stop myself. Do you know a woman named Kelsey Adams? The silence changed shape. Then he said a little too quickly that it was old work stuff and not important. He said he would call later, and did not. In the afternoon, Heather came over with wet curls and a paper bag. She set soup on my stove and scrolled through her phone. People are relentless, she said. But not all of them are monsters. A local shelter posted that you volunteered there for years. The librarian from your branch chimed in with a story about you reading to kids in pajamas night. Then she tilted the screen. And look, a news producer named Jessica wants to talk. She is with PDX-24. She reached out to me, and to you. She says off the record at first. I felt my stomach drop the way it does on a bridge when a truck goes by. I do not want the circus. I said, you do not have to. Heather said, but if you want the truth told clean, pick someone who wants that too. At least hear her out. We ate in the quiet way people eat when they are grateful and tired. After she left, I washed the bowls and let the sink run longer than needed, just to hear something steady. The house felt less like a wound for an hour. Toward evening, a delivery driver knocked, shook the rain off his cap, and handed me another manila envelope. This one from a law firm in the Pearl. Inside was a letter, written in smooth phrases, that boiled down to be advised and govern yourself accordingly. They accused me of interfering with Emily's professional contracts and of encouraging harassment by failing to correct the public narrative. They included screenshots of comments I had never seen. I called Nancy and read the headings. She listened without interrupting. Then said, "Breathe. Forward the whole packet and do not respond to them at all. We send a preservation letter in the morning. Also, start a folder. Every message, every envelope, every call you can log, dates, times, screenshots. If this escalates, that paper trail will be gold." There was a pause. Then I heard her tap something on her keyboard. "One more thing," she said. "I want you to pull any paperwork you have for the house. Deeds, refinances, tax notices, anything with signatures. Tomorrow we ask the county for the latest record set. But bring what you have. I want to see your signature next to theirs." I said I would. After we hung up, I went to the hall closet and took down the old tin box Daniel called the sensible place. Inside were passports long expired. The deed we had framed once before, deciding that felt tacky. And a file stamped with the county seal. I set it on the dining table and did not open it yet. My name in blue ink looked like it belonged to a calm person who always knew where she stood. I touched the edge of the folder like you touch a sleeping hand you love. The phone buzzed again. A text from a number I did not know. "Please tell your side. My mother lived with a woman like her and lost 10 years to shame." It was signed with a first name and a heart. Another message followed. "Cruel and efficient. Drama queen. Get over yourself." Then another. Simply, "Thank you for being brave." I did not feel brave. I felt old and awake. At 7. Heather texted again. "Turn on PDX-24. I did. The segment was titled, "What We Know and What We Do Not." The anchor's voice was steady. Her words careful. They ran a timeline. The video slowed frame by frame. They brought on a therapist who talked about family systems and humiliation. Then they cut to a reporter outside a downtown building. Jessica Nguyen. She looked straight into the camera and said the sources around the couple had been inconsistent and that her team had verified the videos were unaltered. She said they had reached out to all parties for comment. When the segment ended, my phone lit up like a July sky. Jessica's email sat at the top of the pile. Polite and clear. She asked for a conversation with the promise of not airing anything I did not approve. I wrote back a short message. "Tomorrow. In person. No makeup team. No angles." She replied inside a minute with a time and a coffee shop near the river. I put the phone down and tried to remember how breathing worked before all of this. My chest rose and fell without drama. I looked around the room and for the first time saw it as if I were walking into a story rather than being pushed through one. Close to 9 there was a soft knock. I opened the door to find Ryan on the porch. Damp from mist and wrung out in the eyes. He did not step in right away. He stood there with his hands in his pockets like a boy who had broken a window. He said he had been driving in circles. He said he did not know how to fix it. He said Emily had spent the afternoon in a glass office while people told her which words would make the internet less angry. He said those words sounded like someone else's mouth. He said he was sorry I had been hurt. He did not say he was sorry she had done it. I asked him if he was afraid of losing his marriage or of losing his mask. He flinched a little. He said he had made mistakes. I asked if one of those was Kelsey. He closed his eyes, then opened them and said it was complicated. I told him, complicated is not a synonym for kind. He nodded, which was not the same as agreeing. He asked if I was going to go on television. I told him I was going to tell the truth somewhere that respected it. He looked around my front room like it might offer him an exit. When he left, he hugged me in the quick way busy people hug their elders. At the bottom of the steps, he turned and said he loved me. I told him I loved him too. Both sentences were true and not enough. When the door closed, I carried the tin box back to the table and finally opened the county file. Inside were stamped pages and a notarized form from last year I did not remember signing. The signature that claimed to be mine looked almost right until you loved me long enough to know better. The loop on the G was stiff. The flourish on the Y, a fraction too proud. I held the paper up to the lamp and felt the room tilt. I set the form down and laid my driver's license beside it. The letters did not lie to themselves. Something sharp and clean moved through me. Maybe anger. Maybe clarity dressed as anger. I slid the suspect page into a clear sleeve and stacked the rest in order. Then I wrote a date and time in a small notebook and underlined it twice. Outside. The rain softened again to that soft tapping I have always loved. I brewed a fresh pot of tea I did not need and let the kettle whistle anyway. The house did not feel smaller or bigger. It felt exact, like a dress finely fitted to your own shoulders. I turned off the overhead light and stood in the quiet while the kettle clicked as it cooled. Tomorrow I would carry the folder to Nancy and tell Jessica what I would and would not say. Tonight I would sit at the table with the papers and the rain and the sound of my own steady breath, and I would let the story find its real spine. The morning started with the kind of light that makes everything look honest. I watched the steam from my tea curl toward the window before picking up the folder. The forged signature stared back like it knew I had finally noticed. I put the papers in my bag, grabbed my coat, and drove to Nancy's office. Traffic along the river was slow. The water high from days of rain. Every bridge looked like a question I hadn't answered yet. When I walked into her office, she was already standing. Sleeves rolled up. Coffee half finished beside her laptop. She motioned for me to sit and said she had news. The kind that needed deep breaths first. She spread the papers across her desk. This form, she said, was recorded with the county clerk last August. A refinance for $95,000 in your name. The funds went into a joint account belonging to Ryan and Emily. My stomach turned. I never refinanced anything, I said. Nancy nodded slowly. That's what I figured. The signature's a match at first glance. But the notary listed wasn't authorized in Oregon that month. Someone forged this. I sat back, hands gripping the arms of the chair. $95,000. That number felt both unreal and familiar. Like a storm cloud hanging overhead that had finally split open. I thought about the envelopes. The bills. The careful way Emily had always mentioned money in passing. She used words like practical and future and stability. I hadn't realized I was financing them all along. Nancy leaned forward. We'll request certified copies and file a fraud report. This changes things. Maggie. We're not just dealing with defamation anymore. I nodded, trying to focus. My pulse was loud in my ears. I said, what happens now? She looked at me for a long moment. Now we make them uncomfortable for once. She helped me sign a few forms, her pen clicking steady as a metronome. Before I left, she touched my arm. You've been surviving in defense mode for too long. It's time to play offense. I managed a thin smile. Offense never came naturally to me, but I was starting to learn. Outside, the air smelled like wet metal. I drove to a small cafe near the river to meet Jessica, the reporter. She was younger than I expected. Late 30s maybe. With dark hair tied back and a notebook already open on the table. She smiled when I sat down. I appreciate you trusting me, she said. I told her I wasn't sure trust was the word yet. Fair, she said, flipping her pen in her fingers. Let's just start with truth. We talked for almost an hour. I told her what happened at the wedding, what Emily had said, what followed after. I showed her the letter, the fake refinance, the interview clip. She listened without interrupting, only asking small questions when I paused. When I finished, she closed her notebook and said softly, "You're not the woman they're trying to make you. You're the story they didn't think you'd tell." I didn't know what to say. She promised not to air anything without my permission. Before leaving, she asked one last question. Why now? Maggie, why fight back after all this? I looked at her and said, because silence used to feel like peace. Now it just feels like permission. By afternoon, the clouds thickened again. I stopped by the grocery store on my way home, picked up soup and a loaf of bread. The cashier, the same young woman from before, handed me the receipt and said quietly, I saw you on the news last night. I hope you're okay. Her kindness was so unexpected it made my throat tighten. I smiled and said, getting there. When I got home, the answering machine was blinking. A message from Ryan. Mom, I don't know what Nancy told you, but please don't do anything drastic. Emily's upset. She says you're spreading lies. Can we just talk before lawyers get involved? He paused. Then added, I didn't know about the refinance. I swear. I sat down, replayed it twice, trying to read between the cracks in his voice. I didn't call back. Instead, I printed the documents Nancy had emailed, highlighting the notary seal, the mismatched initials. My hands were steady now. Every mark of falseness on those papers was its own small confession. As night came, Heather dropped by again. She carried takeout and gossip, both in equal measure. She set the food on the table and said, the story's blowing up. Jessica's teaser hit social media an hour ago. She didn't name names, but people are connecting dots. Emily shut down her account. Her PR firm posted some half apology about misinformation and privacy. Heather grinned. I think they're scared. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired. I said, fear doesn't clean the damage. Heather nodded, chewing a bite of lo mein. No. But it's a start. We ate in silence for a bit. Then she said, you know this isn't just about revenge. Right, you're teaching people like her that women our age don't go quietly anymore. I looked at her, and really looked, and realized how grateful I was that she'd refused to look away when everyone else did. After she left, I went to my bedroom and opened the window a crack. The air was cold, but it smelled like something new. I sat on the edge of the bed with the file still in my lap. $95,000, a number that could have ruined me. But instead, it had woken me. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. I know what she did to you. We should talk. It was followed by a name I recognized but couldn't place immediately. Kelsey Adams. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. My first instinct was caution. Then curiosity took its turn. I typed back, who are you to them? The reply came quickly. I used to work with Emily. She's not who she says she is. Call me tomorrow. I can prove it. I set the phone down, heart racing in that mix of fear and possibility. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper. I walked to the window and watched the streetlights shimmer across the wet pavement. Everything looked sharper, more defined, as if the world had been smudged and was finally being wiped clean. I thought of Daniel again. The way he used to say, storms don't just pass. They reveal. Maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't the end of anything. Maybe it was the beginning of the reckoning. I turned off the lamp, leaving the phone glowing softly on the table beside me. Tomorrow I would call Kelsey. Tonight I would rest, if only to remind myself that I could. The truth had finally started to move, and I planned to keep walking right beside it. The morning came too early. I woke before my alarm, the gray light spilling across the ceiling like a slow confession. The phone sat on the nightstand, its screen black and waiting. I stared at it for a while before picking it up and scrolling to the message from Kelsey Adams. My thumb hovered over her name until I finally typed 3 words. We can talk. Now. The reply came in less than a minute. Meet me at Hawthorne Coffee in an hour. Back corner. I got dressed without thinking much about what I put on. Jeans and a sweater. My hair still damp from the shower. I didn't bother with makeup. I looked tired, but that felt honest. The drive across town was quiet, except for the low hum of the heater. Portland streets were half asleep. Slick with rain and fallen leaves. The kind of morning that blurs time. The cafe smelled of espresso and cinnamon. A young barista with a nose ring smiled as I walked in. The place wasn't crowded. Just a few students and an older couple sharing a newspaper. In the back corner sat a woman about 30. Hair, dark blonde. Eyes alert in a way that said she'd been carrying secrets too long. When she saw me, she stood up. Nervous, but determined. Maggie. Right, she said. Her voice had that quick rhythm of someone who didn't know how to slow down anymore. I nodded, and she motioned for me to sit. We both wrapped our hands around our coffee cups like anchors. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, I worked with Emily at Carter PR 3 years ago. She wasn't always married, but she was always performing like she was someone better than everyone else. I didn't respond. I just waited. Kelsey leaned in. She was good at manipulating stories. Even before she met your son, she knew how to twist things. Make herself the victim. I saw her ruin a client's career once, and she laughed about it later. She said, people only remember who cries first. I felt my stomach tighten. What does this have to do with me? I asked. Kelsey looked down at her coffee. 6 months before her wedding, she started talking about buying a house with Ryan. Said she had connections, that she could fast-track the mortgage by putting it in your name. I didn't believe her until she showed me copies of paperwork with your signature. I asked how she got them, and she said, oh, the old woman signs anything if it looks official enough. The words hit me harder than I expected. The old woman. I tried to picture Emily saying it. That bright smile curling into contempt. Kelsey kept talking. She also bragged about a backup plan, in case the marriage didn't go as planned. She said your son was easier to manage when money was on the line. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a cold kind of clarity. I asked, why tell me this now? Kelsey looked out the window. Because she did the same thing to me. She made me sign something I didn't read. Said it was for a tax filing. And then used it to push me out of the company. I lost everything I built there. So when I saw your face on the news, I knew exactly what happened. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. I made copies of the company emails before I left. She said, there's a thread between her and her accountant about falsifying notary documents. My name's in there. Yours might be too. I stared at the flash drive. Small enough to lose. Heavy enough to change everything. I asked. Why give this to me? She smiled. But it wasn't a happy smile. Because I'm done being quiet. Maybe you can use it better than I did. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop, and the smell of wet asphalt drifted in. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded older than I remembered. Thank you, I said. She nodded, then gathered her coat and left without looking back. I stayed there for a long time after she left, the flash drive resting in my palm. Around noon, I drove to Nancy's office. She was mid-call but waved me in. When she saw my face, she hung up immediately. What happened? She asked. I placed the flash drive on her desk. Proof, I said. Or at least part of it. Nancy raised an eyebrow. She plugged it into her laptop. And for a few minutes, the only sound was the clicking of keys. Then she exhaled sharply. Emails. Lots of them. She turned the screen toward me. One line stood out. We'll handle the paperwork under her name. The notary won't check as long as it's scanned. My heart thudded once. Hard. Nancy looked at me. This is more than fraud. Maggie. This is identity theft. and depending on how much she withdrew. It could be federal. I felt my hands trembling. But not from fear. From certainty. I said, "Then let's not waste time." Nancy smiled. Fierce and proud. "I'll get my paralegal to copy everything. We'll send it to the county investigator and the bank fraud division by morning." She paused. "Maggie. This changes the leverage. Once this hits, Emily and Ryan will have to answer." The sound of their names together made me flinch. I said quietly, "I just want the truth in the open." She nodded. "You'll get that. But be ready. When you take control of the story, people who live off lies get desperate." By the time I left her office, the sky had darkened again. The city looked smaller somehow, like it was folding in on itself. I drove home slow, my thoughts louder than the rain. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the kitchen window. The flash drive was now locked in Nancy's safe, but its presence still hummed in my mind. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Then my phone buzzed. A new voicemail. It was Ryan. His voice sounded strained, almost breaking. "Mom, please call me. Emily's freaking out. She says people are digging into her company. I don't know what's going on. But they mentioned your name. Please. Just tell me you didn't start this." I listened twice. The way you look at something painful until it loses its power. He sounded scared. Not of me, but of losing what she'd built around him. I thought about calling him back, then didn't. He needed to sit with it. The same way I had. Outside, the streetlights flickered across the puddles. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, then faded. I stood up, feeling the ache in my knees, and turned off the lights one by one. Tomorrow, Nancy would file the papers. Tomorrow, the truth would start to move through the system like water finding its cracks. I didn't know what it would cost, or who it would wash away first. But for the first time in months, I could breathe without shaking. I went to bed with the rain still tapping the window. Steady and sure. The kind of rain that doesn't just fall, but insists on being heard. The morning after the rain stopped, the air felt new again. The kind that smells like something about to happen. I woke up before the alarm. The sky outside a pale, forgiving blue. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the quiet of my house. That rare, solid kind of quiet that comes right before a storm of a different kind. Nancy had promised to file everything first thing. She said once the fraud complaint hit the system, things would move fast. I wasn't sure what fast meant anymore, but I had learned patience could be a weapon too. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching a crow pick at something on the sidewalk. The world was still turning. People still going to work. Still stopping for bagels and gas and small talk. Somewhere in that rhythm, my life had cracked open. At 10, the phone rang. It was Jessica, the reporter. Her voice was bright but steady, like she'd been up since dawn. "Maggie," she said. "The station confirmed your interview for tomorrow evening. We'll record it in studio. Nothing live. You'll have final approval." I felt my chest tighten and release all at once. I said, "All right." She paused, then added, "I know this is hard, but the story's turning. People are starting to see you differently." After we hung up, I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. For the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own story. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Heather stood there, holding a grocery bag and her usual storm of energy. She pushed inside before I could say anything. "I brought soup," she said. "And gossip." I raised an eyebrow. "Gossip first, then soup." She set the bag down and leaned on the counter. "Word is, Emily's firm lost 2 big clients this week. Something about ethical inconsistencies." She grinned. "You think karma checks email, I smiled despite myself. I didn't feel giddy about it. Just quiet. There was no joy in watching someone else's world crack, even if they'd tried to bury me under theirs. Heather ladled soup into bowls, the smell of tomato and basil filling the kitchen. "You look calmer," she said. I said, "Maybe that's what truth feels like once it starts breathing." We ate together, not saying much. After she left, I cleaned up slowly, careful not to rush through anything. Each movement felt deliberate, grounding. By late afternoon, I drove to Nancy's office. She greeted me with that look she always had when something was both good and dangerous. She said, "The county clerk verified the documents. The notary was fake, the signature mismatched, and the mortgage funds traced directly to Emily's account." She leaned back in her chair. "It's airtight, Maggie. They'll open a formal investigation within the week." I exhaled, my hands gripping the chair. She asked if I was ready for what came next. I told her I didn't know if ready was the word, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Then she said something that stayed with me. "You're not just winning a case, Maggie. You're reclaiming your name." When I left, the city was washed clean from the night before. I drove along the river, the light glinting on the water like it was applauding something unseen. That night, I sat in bed, reading through the notes Nancy had given me. Legal words I barely understood, but they all led to one truth: my life had been rewritten without my permission. And now I was taking back the pen. Around 9. The phone buzzed again. I didn't recognize the number. When I answered, the voice on the other end was trembling. "Maggie, it's Ryan. Please, you have to listen." I closed my eyes. I said, "I'm listening." He took a shaky breath. "Emily knows about the investigation. She's falling apart. She thinks you're out to destroy her. She's talking about leaving the country." I said, "I'm not out to destroy anyone. I'm just done being invisible." He went quiet. Then he said, "Mom, I made mistakes. I let her handle everything. I didn't look at what she was doing. I wanted to believe her because it was easier." His voice cracked. "I just didn't want to lose her." I could hear the wind through his car window, a hollow sound that made me ache. "Ryan," I said softly, "you didn't lose her. She lost herself, and you helped her do it." He didn't argue. He just said, "I don't know what to do." I said, "Start by telling the truth. That's always the beginning." After we hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at the phone. I didn't feel triumph or pity, just something quiet and raw, like the air after lightning. Before bed, I went to the hall closet and pulled out one of Daniel's old coats. It still smelled faintly of pine and the outdoors. I slipped it on and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to bite, but it woke me up in the best way. I stood in the driveway, looking up at the half moon, the same one that had been there through every version of my life. Tomorrow would be the interview, the start of something bigger than I could yet imagine. But tonight, for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt like the ground had finally stopped shifting beneath me. Inside, I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the lamp near Daniel's photo. The house was quiet again, but not heavy. It felt steady, like it had found its rhythm again. I sat down at the table with my notebook and wrote one line before going to bed. The truth doesn't always set you free right away. Sometimes, it just teaches you how to stand still while the storm passes. Then, I closed the book, set it beside the photo, and went to sleep with the rain starting up again. Soft and sure, like an old friend coming home. The studio lights were brighter than I expected. The makeup artist dabbed at my face, murmuring something about shine. But my mind was somewhere else. I watched the reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me steady, older, but not defeated. Jessica appeared behind me, holding a clipboard and a smile that almost reached her eyes. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. They guided me to the chair in front of the camera. The room smelled faintly of coffee and nervousness. Jessica sat across from me, her tone softer than I remembered from the newsroom. She said we'd start easy. Just talk like we were old friends. I almost laughed at that. Old friends didn't usually need cameras to listen. She began with questions about the wedding, about the viral video that started everything. I answered slowly. Not rehearsed. Just honest. She asked what it felt like to watch my family fracture in front of the world. I told her it felt like realizing the cracks had always been there. We just painted over them every year until the light finally hit right. At some point, I forgot about the cameras. The words just came. I talked about Emily, the lies, the forged papers, the feeling of being erased by people I loved. Jessica didn't interrupt. She only said one thing that stayed with me. You're not the villain in this story, Maggie. You're the mirror. When it was over, she took off her microphone and touched my arm. Thank you for trusting me, I said. Just tell it straight. No drama. No pity. She smiled. The truth is dramatic enough. On my way out, the producer stopped me in the hallway. He was a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a kind smile. He said quietly, "My mom went through something similar. She never talked about it. I'm glad you did." I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed his hand. Outside, the air felt cleaner than the studio lights. The afternoon sun hit the glass doors, blinding for a second. I stood there, eyes closed, letting the warmth sink in. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. That evening, I drove to the river. The city was glowing with early spring light, the kind that made even old buildings look forgiving. I parked near the bridge Daniel used to love. The river moved slow, calm but relentless. I sat there, thinking about all the times I'd come here when things felt too heavy to hold at home. My phone buzzed. A message from Nancy. The county investigator confirmed the fraud report has been escalated. Expect contact from the DA's office within 48 hours. My heart thudded once. Hard but steady. It was happening. Then another message came through. This time from Ryan. "Mom, please meet me. Just you. I need to talk in person." I hesitated, then typed back, "Tomorrow morning, the park near the river." He replied right away, "Thank you." When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I poured a small glass of wine and sat in the quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Life kept moving. Small and ordinary. Even when everything else was changing. The next morning was cool and gray. I found Ryan sitting on a bench by the pond, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He looked older. Not from age, but from wear. When he saw me, he stood, uncertain. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on the word. I sat beside him. Neither of us spoke at first. Ducks skimmed across the water, their ripples spreading wider than they knew. Finally, he said, "She's gone. Emily left last night. Took her things. Wiped her accounts. Said she couldn't face the humiliation." I waited for the ache to come. But all I felt was a strange, hollow calm. Ryan kept talking. I didn't stop her. I didn't even try. I just sat there. He rubbed his face, his voice shaking. "I know what she did. I read the papers Nancy sent. I should have protected you. Mom, I was so busy trying to keep peace that I didn't see what it cost you." I looked at him for a long time. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight, the same way his father used to look after losing a case. I said, "You can't protect people who don't want to be honest. Ryan, you can only decide who you'll be after the truth shows up." He nodded. tears slipping down his cheeks. I wanted to hate her, he said. But part of me still loves her. That's the cruel part of betrayal. It leaves you loyal to ghosts. We sat there until the wind picked up. He finally said, "I'll help you with the legal stuff. I owe you that much." I touched his hand. "You don't owe me anything. Just learn from it." Later that afternoon, Nancy called. The DA wanted a meeting. I drove to her office. My heart steady this time. She looked up from her papers as I entered. Eyes sharp. "The DA's office is moving forward," she said. "They'll press charges for fraud, forgery, and theft." I stared at her for a long second, trying to absorb the words. Then she added, "They may ask you to testify." I nodded. "I'll do it." She smiled. "Proud. You're stronger than they ever thought you were." By the time I got home, dusk had settled, soft and pink. I made a pot of tea, the same way I used to when Daniel was alive. The steam rose in thin spirals, filling the air with comfort. My hands trembled only slightly when I held the cup. I thought about Emily, about the way she smiled through lies, about how the truth had finally started to reach her. I didn't wish her pain, but I didn't wish her escape either. Some lessons only stick when they cost something. That night, as I turned off the lights, the phone buzzed again. A new email from Jessica. "The network's preview of your interview airs tomorrow. It's powerful. Maggie, you should be proud." I read the message twice before closing my laptop. I wasn't sure pride was the word. Relief. Maybe. Vindication. Perhaps. Or just peace. Quiet and earned. I went to bed with the sound of wind in the trees. That steady, whispering rhythm that had followed me through every storm. For once, it didn't sound like warning. It sounded like promise. The morning of the interview's release started quiet. The city outside was still damp from a night of rain, and the sky held that soft silver color that makes everything feel suspended. I made my coffee and stood by the window, the steam rising in curls that disappeared into the glass. I hadn't slept much. Not from fear, but from something that felt close to anticipation. By 8, the segment had gone live. I didn't plan to watch it, but Heather called before I could change my mind. "Turn on Channel 7, she said, her voice breathless. "They're airing it now." I sat down on the couch, the mug warm in my hands, and clicked the remote. The opening shot was of the wedding photo. That perfect, glittering moment before everything fell apart. Then came my voice, calm but lined with something heavier. I watched myself talk about betrayal, family, and the cost of silence. The camera caught every line on my face, every pause between words. I didn't look broken. I looked real. When it ended, the host thanked Jessica for bringing a human story of resilience. My name appeared at the bottom of the screen: Maggie Doyle, Portland resident, retired teacher, survivor of family fraud. The word survivor hit me like an echo I hadn't expected. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Messages from neighbors, old students, even people I hadn't spoken to in decades. Most of them said the same thing: "Proud of you. Took courage." Finally, someone said what we all feel. I read them slowly, letting each one sink in. Then I turned off the phone and went outside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. Across the street, Mrs. Henson, from 2 houses down, was trimming her hedges. When she saw me, she waved. "That story of yours," she said, shaking her head, "took guts." "Maggie." I smiled and said, "Maybe it just took enough years of keeping quiet." Later that afternoon, Nancy called. Her tone was brisk, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. "The DA has officially filed charges," she said. "Fraud, forgery, and identity theft. A warrant's out for Emily. I sat down on the porch step. Heart steady but full. She added, "They may arrest her within the week." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just listened to the sound of the wind in the trees. Finally, I said, "Thank you. Not just for this, but for believing me when I didn't know how to believe myself." Nancy's voice softened. "You did all the hard parts. Maggie, I just helped turn on the light." After the call, I sat there for a long time. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of stillness that happens before dusk. I thought about Emily, about how her lies had finally hit the wall of truth. I didn't feel triumph, just release, like air finally escaping a room that had been sealed too long. That evening, Ryan showed up unannounced. He looked tired but clearer somehow, like a man who'd finally stopped running. He stood on the porch, holding a small box. I didn't say anything at first. He said, "I wanted you to have this." Inside were a few photos. Old ones, back when things were simple. Him as a boy in the backyard with Daniel. Me laughing behind the camera. He smiled faintly. "I found them in storage. Thought maybe they should be somewhere honest again." I nodded and took the box. "You didn't have to," I said. He shrugged. "Maybe I needed to." We stood there for a moment. The air between us, thick with everything that had gone unsaid for years. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry, Mom, for believing her more than you. I should have known better." I shook my head. We all believe what we want to be true until the truth leaves us no choice. He nodded slowly. "You always said storms show who built strong roofs." He smiled just a little. Guess I learned. After he left, I set the photos on the kitchen table. One of them showed Daniel and Ryan building a birdhouse together, their hands covered in sawdust. I traced the edges of the picture with my thumb, remembering the smell of wood and sunlight, the sound of laughter. I poured myself tea and sat in the same chair I'd once used to help Ryan with homework. Everything felt full circle, but not in a painful way, more like closing a door softly after years of drafts. Later that night, Jessica called. Her voice carried a kind of disbelief. "Maggie, it's gone national. The interview. People are talking about financial abuse and elder fraud. You started something." I laughed quietly. "I didn't start anything, Jessica. I just stopped pretending." She was silent for a moment, then said, "You'd be surprised how many people need permission to stop pretending too." After I hung up, I went out to the porch. The sky was streaked with stars, the kind that only appear after heavy rain. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I took a deep breath and let the night settle around me. Before heading inside, I checked my messages one more time. There was one I didn't expect. An email from Emily. The subject line read simply, "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The message was short. "Maggie, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't have excuses. I let ambition turn into poison, and I used your kindness as fuel for it. The truth finally caught me. And maybe that's justice. I'll turn myself in tomorrow. Tell Ryan I loved him, even when I didn't know how to show it." I closed the laptop, my eyes burning. There were no tears, just that deep ache that sits somewhere between sorrow and relief. For all her wrongs, she was still human, and maybe that was the hardest part to remember. I went to bed with the window open, the night air cool against my face. Somewhere outside, the world was moving toward whatever came next. I didn't know what that was, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid to find out. When I closed my eyes, the sound of rain began again, soft and rhythmic, as if the sky itself had been waiting to wash everything clean. The morning light came through soft and blue, the kind that makes the world feel gentler than it deserves to be. I woke up before the alarm again, listening to the sound of rain fading into silence. For a few seconds, I didn't remember what day it was. And then it hit me. Court day. I got dressed, slowly. Choosing a dark gray suit I hadn't worn since Daniel's funeral. It still fit. A little looser around the shoulders, but good enough. I tied my hair back and looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look like the woman who'd been erased from her own life. I looked like someone who'd come back to claim it. Outside. The street was slick and glistening. The air cool enough to bite. I drove downtown, with the radio off. Hands steady on the wheel. The courthouse loomed up ahead. Stone and glass, catching the weak sunlight. Nancy met me on the steps. Her umbrella dripping. She smiled. Brief but sure. You ready? She said. I nodded. Inside? Everything smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The marble floors echoed with footsteps and whispers. Ryan was already there, sitting on a bench near the courtroom doors. When he saw me, he stood. His expression a mix of guilt and relief. I said, "You didn't have to come." He shook his head. I did. Emily wasn't there yet. For a moment, I wondered if she would show at all. Then the heavy doors opened, and she walked in with her attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair pulled back. Her face pale. When her eyes met mine, there was no anger. Just exhaustion. We took our seats. The bailiff called the room to order. My heart was calm. Strangely so. The judge, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, asked for opening statements. Nancy stood first, clear and precise, laying out every detail, every forged document, every transfer. She spoke with calm authority, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Emily's lawyer tried to paint it as confusion, a misunderstanding of financial trust. He said Emily never intended harm, that she was overwhelmed, that love had blurred judgment. I almost laughed. Love didn't blur judgment, it sharpened denial. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the stand and took the oath. The microphone buzzed faintly when I leaned in. Nancy asked gentle questions at first. About how it started. About the loan. The wedding. The lies. My answers came steady, one truth at a time. Then came the harder part. She asked, "Mrs. Doyle, when did you realize your family had betrayed you?" I looked over at Emily, who was staring down at her hands. I said, when silence started to sound like permission. The room went still. Even the judge stopped writing for a second. Nancy nodded slowly and said, "No further questions." Emily's lawyer stood next. He asked about forgiveness, about family, about whether I thought Emily deserved a second chance. I said, "Second chances are for people who make mistakes, not for people who build them." When I stepped down, my knees felt weak, but I kept walking. Ryan caught my arm as I passed. He whispered, "You did good, Mom." I squeezed his hand, grateful that he was there at all. By afternoon, the testimonies were over. The judge recessed for an hour to review the documents. I went outside to the courthouse courtyard, sat on a bench under a maple tree, still dripping from rain. The air smelled like wet earth and something close to hope. Emily came out a few minutes later, without her lawyer. She hesitated before sitting at the far end of the same bench. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, quietly, I didn't know how to stop lying. Every time I wanted to tell the truth, I thought about losing everything. I looked at her. You didn't lose everything, Emily. You traded it for control. And now, you're just holding ashes. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I know. Her voice broke. I know what I did. I didn't say anything more. There was nothing left to say. Some apologies are just air, leaving a collapsing wall. When the judge called us back in, I felt a strange calm. The courtroom was full again. The air thick with expectation. Judge Marlowe adjusted her glasses and began reading the decision. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, she said, "It is clear that the defendant engaged in deliberate fraud and financial exploitation. The court orders full restitution to the plaintiff, the return of assets, and additional penalties to be determined in a separate hearing." She paused, her gaze softening just slightly. "Mrs. Doyle, the court acknowledges your courage in pursuing justice in a matter that is too often buried in shame and silence. You've done more than reclaim what was yours. You've set a precedent." Her words sank deep. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just nodded. Because that was all I could do. When it ended, Emily was led out quietly. Ryan stood beside me, not saying anything. Outside, the sky had cleared into a wide, pale blue. We walked down the courthouse steps together. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "You okay?" I looked at him and answered honestly, "Not yet. But I will be." We stood there for a while, watching people pass. Everyone wrapped up in their own stories, their own unfinished endings. Then he said, "You going to stay in Portland?" I smiled faintly. "For now. The house feels different lately. Lighter." That evening, when I got home, the light through the kitchen window was golden. Soft on the countertop, I poured tea and sat at the table, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside. The quiet didn't hurt anymore. It just existed. I picked up one of the photos Ryan had brought the day before. The one of Daniel and him with the birdhouse. The smile on Daniel's face was the same one that had carried me through every hard moment since he'd gone. I whispered, "We did it. You know, not revenge. Just truth." And it was enough. As the sun slipped lower, shadows stretched across the walls. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a train whistle, low and steady, fading into the evening. I closed my eyes and let the sound carry me, knowing the hardest part was behind me now, and what came next would finally belong only to me. In the weeks that followed, the days found their own pace again. The house woke up with the light and settled with the dark, and I learned how to move inside it without bracing for the next alarm. The court scheduled a separate hearing on penalties, and Nancy said the words I had been waiting to hear. Restitution was in motion. She said it the way a nurse might say the bleeding has stopped. Not a celebration, a fact. News traveled as news does. Emily turned herself in the next morning, just as her email had promised. There were photos outside the building that I did not look at. She entered a plea that kept her out of prison if she repaid what she took and completed a program for financial offenders. I did not ask for details. The law was doing its work. That was enough. Ryan started coming by on Sunday afternoons. He would text first, asking if it was a good time. And then he would stand in the kitchen with a bag of groceries, like a peace offering. We cooked together in the quiet way people do when there is more to say than words can carry. He told me he had started seeing a counselor, that he was peeling back his own excuses, the way you scrape paint off a window to let more light in. He said he was sorry in different ways, not as a performance, but as a practice. I believed him a little more each week. One evening, he brought a small box from the garage at his place. Inside were the wooden pieces of an old birdhouse kit he had found. He said that he had been thinking about the photo of him and Daniel, the one with the sawdust on their hands, and that maybe we could build one for my yard. We cleared the table and laid out the pieces. He sanded the edges while I found the little nails that never stay in one place. It took longer than it should have, because we kept stopping to check the fit and laugh when something sat crooked. But when we finished, it looked like something that could belong in the world. He climbed the small ladder and hung it from the maple by the fence. We stepped back and let the evening hold the moment. A pair of sparrows came the next morning, as if they had been waiting their turn all along. Jessica called once more to tell me that the station had started a resource series on elder fraud and family financial abuse. They were highlighting clinics and legal aid groups every week. She asked if I would do a follow-up, just a short segment about boundaries and what I would tell someone in my place. I said yes, but only if they focused on the resources more than my face. She laughed softly and said that was exactly the plan. Kelsey sent a note that said she had been hired by a small marketing firm in Selwood, that someone had seen the investigative piece and reached out. She said she had started sleeping again. We met for coffee on Hawthorne one morning. She looked lighter. The kind of light that happens after you stop carrying something heavy for too long. We talked about small things first, the kind that make conversation feel safe again. Then we said the one thing that mattered. We were both done being silent. Heather threw what she called a tiny party that was not a party at all. Just two friends with lemon bars and a candle for no reason. She said the neighborhood had decided I was the person who kept the lights honest. I told her that sounded like a lot of responsibility for a retired woman with a small ladder. She said that was why I would be good at it. We sat on her porch and watched the street breathe. Sometimes, healing is exactly that plain. There were practical steps too. Nancy walked me through a budget that felt like a map back to myself. We closed accounts I no longer needed and opened one that was mine alone, with safeguards that made both of us relax. I met with a woman from the bank who specialized in fraud recovery for older adults. She taught me how to set alerts that would chirp if anything moved where it should not. The first night, those alerts were live. I slept without waking at 3. The sentencing hearing came and went, with less drama than anyone expected. The judge spoke in a measured tone about accountability and the difference between remorse and regret. She ordered structured repayment and community service tied to education on financial ethics. Emily nodded without looking up. When it was over, she did not turn toward me. That felt right. Some goodbyes are better unspoken. Spring slid into early summer, and the city loosened its shoulders. The farmers' market opened near the park, and I started buying too many cherries on purpose so I would have to share them. People recognized me sometimes, but they did it gently. A woman stopped me by the flower stand and said that she had watched the interview with her grown daughter, and that they had talked for the first time in months. She thanked me in a way that made my eyes sting. I told her I was just one voice, and that the real courage was in the conversation she had after the TV was turned off. I began volunteering at the community center on Thursdays, helping with a small group that offered financial basics and support for people who had been taken advantage of by family. The first day I stood in front of them, my hands shook. I told them that I was not there as an expert, but as someone who had learned the hard way how to say no without apology. A man with tired eyes asked how to start when your own son is the one asking. I said start with the truth and a locked account, and then keep going even when it makes your hands shake. We nodded together like people who had all learned to breathe again. Ryan came to one of those Thursdays and sat in the back. Afterward, he helped stack chairs. Then he said quietly that listening had felt like putting a mirror on a table and not looking away. I told him that was a good place to begin. He asked if I thought forgiveness had a timetable. I said, people try to loan you their clocks for that, but yours is the only one that matters. We walked to the car without solving anything, which felt honest. One evening, near the end of July, I took the box of old photos to the dining table and sorted through them with a glass of iced tea. I found a picture of Daniel and me on a fishing pier at the coast, the wind doing its best to make us look foolish. I held it up to the light and said that we had done all right. The grief had changed shape by then. It no longer felt like a wave that knocked me flat. It felt like ballast. Heavy, but steady, helping me keep my course when the air went still. That same week, the birdhouse got its third set of tenants, a pair of ruffled little birds who seemed irritated by everything except each other. I watched them from the kitchen window. Their tiny arguments and sudden truce. Life keeps going, even when we learn hard lessons. Maybe especially then. Nancy and I had lunch on the courthouse steps one bright day. She brought salads and a smug smile that she pretended was humility. She said the state had asked her to consult on a training for local notaries and mortgage brokers about fraud prevention. She said she had used my case as the reason the training should exist. I told her the county should put a plaque somewhere quiet that said, "Do not underestimate older women with good records." She laughed and said she would draft the language. On a slow Sunday, Ryan and I drove out to the river where he used to skip rocks as a boy. He told me he had applied for a transfer at work and had started a class on ethical leadership. He said the words without trying to make them shiny. He asked if I would be willing to come to one session where they talk about accountability. I said yes, and that I would not soften the story for his comfort. He said that was the point. As the season leaned toward fall, I found myself standing in the doorway more often, letting the evening air move through the rooms. I kept the birdhouse in view, and the kettle on the stove, and learned to enjoy the sound of a house that belonged to its owner again. The quiet did not feel like absence anymore. It felt like space. If you have been the steady one for so long that you forgot what your own voice sounds like, I hope you hear this part clearly. Silence is not kindness when it only protects the people who hurt you. The first no will shake your hands. The second no will make you stronger. By the third, you will wonder why you ever called it selfish to save your own life. I am not interested in revenge. I learned that it tastes like sugar at first and ash by the end. What I wanted, and what I found, was something simpler. Justice that fit the facts. Boundaries that held. A future that did not require me to disappear to make other people comfortable. If this story sat close to your bones, stay with me. Share it with someone who needs the courage to change a lock, or make a call, or say the first true word in a long time. Tell me in the comments where you are in your own storm, and what you want the calm to look like when it comes. Subscribe if you want more stories that do not look away from the hard parts and still find their way to the light. I will be here on Thursdays at the Community Center and right here with you, reminding us both that peace is not something given. It is something you build, one honest choice at a time.